Hello, and welcome to the Rare Dementia Support FTD Support Group annual seminar. Very happy to have people here. We were just talking before the meeting that this is 1 year ago. We were just planning for an in-person meeting, but then COVID struck. And so we spent a year doing virtual meetings for the FTD group. So my name's Dr. Jonathan Rohrer. I work at UCL and a place called Dementia Research Centre, but also at the National Hospital for Neurology. And we've been running this group for quite a number of years. So welcome to all of you that are new to this meeting. And this meeting is a little bit different than our other support group meetings. So this annual seminar is aimed really at giving at least some of you an introduction to frontotemporal dementia, but also trying to give you an update about what's happening and what's happening in research, but also give you the opportunity to ask questions from a set of experts, both from a clinical side of things, but also from a care side of things and financial and legal aspects. So I know for some of you that have been involved in the group for many years, some of the first things you hear will be a bit of a recap, but hopefully there'll be new things to learn, even of people that have been involved in the group for some years. So welcome to you all, both new and people who've been involved in the group for some time. So the programme for today is that you will hear initially really an introduction to frontotemporal dementia from Professor James Rowe, who is someone I've worked with for many years and who is an expert in dementia, and particularly FTD and the FTD spectrum of disorders, who works at the University of Cambridge. And runs a specialist research centre and clinic up in Cambridge. Following that, you'll hear a little bit about where we are with clinical trials in frontotemporal dementia from Lucy Russell, who works as a postdoctoral researcher at UCL. And we're always very privileged to have a member of the group come and talk to us about their experience. And Linda Brown very kindly has offered to talk about her experience of being a carer for somebody with frontotemporal dementia. We'll then have a talk from Michael Marshall about the legal aspects and rare dementia support. And then there's time for questions, and we really do. I'm very happy to try and answer as many questions that people have about things. So please do put those in the chat section or send them directly to us, and we'll be monitoring the emails. But please do put them in the chat for questions that you'd like us to answer during that last 45-minute session. So, having caught my breath back after that, we will get started with a talk from James Rowe, just setting the stage for things and making sure we're all on the same page and we understand what we're talking about with this condition called frontotemporal dementia.
Hello, I'm James Rowe. I'm a neurologist in Cambridge, and I lead the Cambridge Centre for Frontotemporal Dementia. We're going to talk this morning about some of the ideas about what makes frontotemporal dementia so special, an introduction to those who might be new to it, but a discussion then about pathways to progress and the way ahead. Now, I'm well aware that many of you in this audience are going to be the real experts. So I'd be very happy to hear the discussion later this morning or through a follow-up conversations if you've got anything to add or contribute. First of all, to give a brief introduction to frontotemporal dementia, I'll use the terms Pick's disease on and off, the historical name. We'll then reflect on what makes frontotemporal dementia so special as an illness, both as an illness to experience and live within the family, but more particularly today I'm going to talk about what makes it special and a challenge for researchers, and that's shaped the way that we are looking into the illness and to the future. I'm going to talk about how and when it begins, because I think this is an area of a lot of confusion, and then using that as a springboard to think about the way ahead, the way the researchers think, and the way this can be closely integrated with clinical care. And that research is looking towards treatments, and I'll be talking about the way that we can treat frontotemporal dementias here and now, and then very briefly touch on the sort of a general way ahead for future, which will lead, I hope, nicely into Lucy's talk, which will focus on really the more detailed future of treatments against frontotemporal dementia. I think it's quite useful sometimes to think back to the original description. So this is Arnold Pick, after whom Pick's disease was named. He described these cases around 130 years ago. There were some previous descriptions in the literature, but he really put it on the map. And it's an illness that's had many names since, and this doesn't help when you're trying to understand the illness or read about it or search on the internet. It's often still known as Pick's disease. For many years, researchers talked about dementia of the frontal type or frontal lobe dementia, and it's only really in the last 15 to 20 years that the field has settled on this idea of frontotemporal dementia. And we'll see in a moment there are a number of different subtypes with the labels here. But let's look at one of Pick's early cases, because I think it's still instructive. He talked about a patient who had progressive cognitive impairment, and progression, fast or slow, is a key part of FTD and distinguishes it from the non-progressive mimics sometimes we see. And the patient had bouts of aggressiveness. Now, aggression is relatively uncommon, but the bouts, I think, is the interesting thing here. It's an intermittent, unpredictable illness. People can be very different in their behavior from moment to moment. His patient had no disturbance of movement, but it's an important lesson we've learned since that around half of patients get what I'm going to call Parkinsonism, which is some slowness, some stiffness and balance problems. It's not Parkinson's disease, but it's Parkinsonism, meaning it's a bit like Parkinson's, up to half of patients. Pick's earlier case had marked aphasia, which is a language problem, difficult in understanding speech, and comprehension is something we see very much today. It's the hallmark of semantic dementia type of FTD. But it wasn't complete. It was sometimes disturbed, but he could understand simple questions and generalities about things familiar to him. And again, this idea of familiarity is really important. I think many of you would have noticed that the member of your family with the illness can do much better in the home setting with familiar people, but takes it out of context, and it's very evident how severe the problems are. So familiarity is key. And there are some things that one just doesn't understand at all, and getting past the understanding barrier can be very tricky. And Pick's early patient was over-talkative, suggesting perhaps being a bit disinhibited, some behavioural problems, as well as the aphasia or language problems. Now, one of the things that was very interesting about the Pick's early case was he showed severe memory deficits, and actually many people with FTD do show memory deficits as part of the package. But as doctors, if there's any doctors listening in, will know, primary memory deficits or episodic memory deficits is actually an exclusion criteria under the current diagnostic system, really trying to highlight the difference between the other type of dementias like Alzheimer's disease versus frontotemporal dementia. But the boundaries are more fuzzy in reality, as Pick's original case demonstrates. So let's pick up on some of these features of behavior and language, and talk about how it relates to the modern way that we diagnose and label frontotemporal dementia. Now, this is an umbrella term, and it includes people who've got behavioural problems. It also includes people who've got language problems. Now, when there's problems with language, we sometimes hear the other phrase of primary progressive aphasia, PPA. But really, there's behaviour and language. And crudely, this corresponds to changes in the frontal part of the brain, dominating the behavioural changes, and the temporal part where language is stored, hence the name of frontotemporal dementia. Now, behavioural changes come in a number of different forms. There's classical behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia. This can come with or without problems with muscle wasting and weakness, which goes by a different name, I'm afraid, yet again, called motor neuron disease. In fact, motor neuron disease can exist as its own illness, perhaps more famous, better well known for that in the media, as its own illness without the frontotemporal part, but there is an overlap. Returning to the language parts of this illness, this again has many different types. There's one version where people have hesitant, agrammatic, bit of telegraphic speech, a bit like a sort of old school telegram for those that remember those. Very different from those with the semantic variant, who might talk very fluently. In fact, to begin with, you might not know there was anything wrong at all. But if you really try and pin someone down on particulars, you realize that they've lost their knowledge for particular words or objects, what things mean, what things are. And different again to somebody with so-called logopenic, which is basically fancy Greek for having lost your words. And this is where it's as if the mental dictionary has gone. But they still know what things are and who's who. This turns out to be a bit of an exception in the family of frontotemporal dementia illnesses, and I'm not going to talk much about this any further. So we talked about overlap between motor neuron disease, but there's some other overlaps with some other rare conditions called progressive supranuclear palsy and corticobasal syndrome. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate the naming system here, but it is, I think, important for at least some members of the audience who are listening in, who might have come to the diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia via some other diagnosis from their neurologist or psychiatrist. And in particular, these two illnesses, which have this Parkinsonism, so not Parkinson's, but looking a bit like, these can morph into frontotemporal dementia, either the behavioral variant with changes in personality and disinhibition and challenging behaviors and apathy, or morph into the loss of language, looking very much like the language variant. So it's complicated, and I think all I want to do is really to recognize the complications and to describe these different terms, because as some of you may have experienced, one person might have been diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, primary progressive aphasia, non-fluent aphasia, or corticobasal syndrome, so someone coming down this pathway. And all of those labels could be correct for a particular patient. It's not that they're wrong. It's not that that person has 4 different rare illnesses. They have one illness, but one illness that has 4 different types of label. And I just know from clinical experience, this can cause a lot of confusion, especially when you're trying to perhaps read up about the illness or explain it to family and friends. Often, I think for the rest of the day, I'm going to talk about frontotemporal dementia as the sort of the headline or umbrella term that captures the rest of this detail. Partly because over time, an individual might start out with a lot of behavioral problems and then get more language problems, or might start out with a language problem and then start to have a change in personality and behavior. So there's an overlap, and with time these illnesses evolve, change their characteristics and the boundaries, all this sort of nice neat framework that doctors talk about with different categories gets very fuzzy. And I think it then comes back to really trying to recognize the individuality of each person, each patient, each family experience is going to be different. So just as we see that each person on the street here, this is pre-COVID days in Cambridge, if we think back to that, you know, everybody here is different, and everybody here will have a different experience, a different way of presenting with their frontotemporal dementia. In the next few minutes, I'm going to think about how we should try and understand brain diseases, how researchers take a sort of a general standpoint on trying to approach brain diseases, thinking a lot about the differences, which I've just talked about, but actually focusing much more on similarities. A lot of the research now focuses on similarities between different brain diseases. We'll come back in terms of treatment later to think about the importance of individuality and treating that specific patient or specific person in the family one by one. So let's think about how sort of biomedical research works first of all. We might read and hear or research in terms of genetics, with the DNA, thinking about how that leads to changes in the chemistry or biochemistry, the sort of the biology that's going on in the body and in the brain. Researchers might then think about how this can be represented in very simple organisms in the laboratory, or even then mammals like mice. And a lot of the research is using transgenic models or mice models, or using these what we call preclinical laboratory systems to try and test out and explore possible ways forward for treatment. And only then would it come into the human context, and then using information from patients and humans to inform all the way back down to the genetics in these earlier stages. So this way of thinking about research could apply to Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, motor neuron disease, psychiatry like depression, anxiety, cancers even, many different diseases. But there's something rather special when it comes to frontotemporal dementia that puts a barrier in the way. And that is that unlike these preclinical laboratory models, which can be brought to fulfillment over days or weeks or at most a few months, people live their life over decades, up to 80 years. Humans have very complex genetics, and we do things in our lifetimes, sometimes that are good for us, like education, building up reserve and resilience in the brain. We also do things that are perhaps not so good, as smoking and drinking and diet. And also the human experience has things that are just special to it about how we communicate with language, the richness of our lifetime's memories, and the way we are part of a family and a society. These are things that can't easily be applied to the laboratory research, and I think means that research into dementia and frontotemporal dementia must always have an eye to what is special about being humans with such an illness. But frontotemporal dementia, again, is special in even more ways than this, because many of the things that apply to dementia research generally don't apply to frontotemporal dementia, as far as we know. Things like alcohol and exercise, smoking and diet don't really have a big part to play in getting the illness. But there's an extra emphasis on those things that are very human, about how we speak and communicate, how we're part of friendships and a society and a social network, and understanding what other people think. And these really are very difficult to capture in laboratory settings. But I emphasize that the illness can unfold over decades. So let's think about how frontotemporal dementia begins. And I'm going to think about what I'm going to call a lifespan of dementia. So what we're very aware of are symptoms, people who have the disabling and challenging dementia, really the fulfillment of this illness, when the problems with thinking and behavior are very evident, perhaps coming on in one's 50s or 60s or 70s. But there's a long period when people might have very mild symptoms, things that might show up perhaps at work, being stressed at work, difficulty coping with colleagues, not really enough to make you think that someone's ill, until the diagnosis comes, and with hindsight you realize that people may have been having difficulties for really some years, 5 or 10 years often. But earlier, even 10 years before that, unbeknownst to you, unbeknownst to researchers, even you're a doctor even, there would have been changes slowly developing in the brain, things that one might see on an MRI scan if only one had ever had cause to look. But at this earlier stage, thinking perhaps in one's 40s, what one feels normal is normal, working, thinking, getting on with just life and the families and all that. But the illness has already begun in the brain. Even earlier than that, perhaps even in one's 20s and 30s, there may be early seeds of this illness, some changes subtly in these connections in the brain, the way that the nerve cells talk to each other. And these come about because what I'm going to call junk proteins. These are natural proteins that we would normally need in good health, but something goes wrong with them and they change their shape, they get sticky. And instead of being nicely ordered in the brain cells, they get sort of all claggy and lumpy. I always think of this in terms of that, cold, sweaty the day after. Instead of being nice and ordered, it goes sticky and claggy, and it stops brain cells working so well. But the way that happens, from the build-up of junk proteins, altering brain connections, causing some subtle shrinkage of the brain, this takes many, many years before even the mildest of symptoms, and certainly before that disabling dementia. And it's important to recognize that when we think about the future of treatment. At the moment, the way that we would treat frontotemporal dementias, and I'll come to that in a moment, is really based around the symptoms and supportive care in this very late phase of the illness. We're increasingly trying to recognize and seeing if we could find ways to make a diagnosis and pick up on the illness 5, 10 years before, when there are very mild changes, when people are independent, might even still be working, but certainly having a very high quality of life for them and the family around. And that would be an ideal stage to try and halt the illness. But we should recognize that even that is actually very late in the course of the disease, which might have been brewing for perhaps even decades, but providing a way in to treat the illness and even perhaps prevent people from becoming unwell. So Lucy will talk more about this in a moment, but different types of treatments to protect the brain connections and stop these junk proteins. As we look ahead though and think about future treatments, or even just immediate treatments, there's going to be a balance to be struck. A treatment might have everything we want, but there could be a compromise. A treatment might be easy to use. It might be very safe. It might be low cost. Okay? And that would be, I think, an ideal treatment. But it could be that things that work, perhaps in the initial generation of treatments, might actually be much more invasive, much more demanding treatments. They could be very, very expensive, but they could be the ones that hit the spot. And there's a trade-off here. So safe, easy treatments, a tablet to take once a day would be ideal. Something that's a little bit more invasive, a little bit more bother, would be like an infusion, perhaps having to go once a month to the hospital to have a drip for an afternoon. A little bit more invasive still, some of the treatments coming along might need to be injected. One could inject perhaps into the spinal fluid so that it flows around from a lumbar puncture, flows around and up and around the head, getting to where it's needed. And some of the more experimental treatments would involve perhaps even neurosurgery, trying to get the treatment into the brain directly. So we can see there's a spectrum. I think ultimately one would want to know, does it work? Does it protect the brain? Does it stop people getting the illness? But there'll be a discussion with you and family members and people with or at risk of frontotemporal dementia about what would be acceptable. We know from other sorts of illness like cancer treatments, because they work so well, people are prepared to put up with really quite intensive treatments with strong side effects in the knowledge that they work. I don't know if that's going to be the same trade-off for frontotemporal dementia, but it could well be. And I think this is a debate that we and you certainly need to be having. Now, there's another way that there are challenges for researchers just about the name. And I've touched on this before about the confusion, the different ways of naming this illness. But it also comes because of what I call fuzzy edges. There aren't really distinctions between these different types of frontotemporal dementia. And that lack of clarity makes it very difficult to say which is the right person for this study. It's okay if they've got a classic illness, but what about if they've got an overlap, behavior and language jointly? The other thing is to say, well, let's focus on treating symptoms, but it's not always clear how symptoms relate to each other and how they change over time and how we measure them. And to prove a new treatment is effective, you need to measure what it's working on. And a lot of work's been going on in the FTD world about finding the best ways to measure what matters and what changes in frontotemporal dementia, so that the trials, when they do come, are going to be really aiming for that right target. And there's another aspect which is about who are we treating. As some of you would have discovered in your families, that the person with frontotemporal dementia may often feel very well, actually rather frustratingly may deny there's anything wrong at all. So we're starting to talk about treatments for somebody who may in themselves feel very well. That the person with frontotemporal dementia, they'll be the one taking all the risks and side effects. And that's difficult to justify perhaps if they feel well, although we recognize the reality that even though they feel well, they may be at risk themselves and they may be causing an immense degree of distress and stress to those around them. So as I look ahead, I think different researchers think in different ways. We need to think on a big scale. We need to be thinking collaboratively, drawing together all the centres of excellence in frontotemporal dementia, understanding the illness across the UK and across the world. And studies like GenFi, led here from the UK by James Rowe at UCL, specifically at the helm, is doing just that, thinking on a very big scale. But we also need to think on a very small scale. What are those tiniest first changes in the brain? The things that are perhaps too small to detect by symptoms, maybe too small even to see with a scanner, but really setting the seed for the illness. We also, I think, need to think about very early treatments, and this is where genetics plays such an important part, as Lucy will talk about, but also not forget the later stages of the disease, where people who have symptoms and have signs of the illness also will need treatment. The real kind of meaty substance of treatment of frontotemporal dementias at the moment is, I think, really around getting people to understand the illness, to know what they're seeing, and to provide a safe and tolerant environment, reducing the distress and impact, not just on the person with the illness, but actually also on those around them, but emphasizing the need for understanding and tolerance, that some of the behaviors that will be seen as so antisocial or disruptive, if they were done with intention, these are part of an illness, and actually with some tolerance and some kindness, they can be tolerated, and therefore to keep the person with the illness feeling well and supported and at home. There's a next level up, which is to focus perhaps more on reducing the harm. And there are ways in which people with particularly the behavioural variant can act out or take risks in a way that could be harmful, or they might have falls and have a risk of physical harm in that way. So there's a whole series of treatments around trying to reduce the risk they present. A lot of that is interventions and behavioural interventions, trying to distract, reduce the risks, and build on habits and good habits that keep each day working better. But only a little bit through medication. I actually see the medication and drugs as it's not even the icing on the cake, it's sort of the cherry on the icing on the cake. And if you don't have these lower basic levels right, drugs are just not going to work. They work in the context of a safe and supportive environment and the context of behavioural measures and other practical steps. And that's probably something that those of you that are living with someone at home still with frontotemporal dementia take in your stride and do throughout the day, thinking about adjusting behaviours, reducing risks and providing that safe environment, and not reaching straight for the medications first of all. But it's a more difficult balance to get right sometimes, particularly when people are in institutional care. But what might those medications be? Well, I'm just going to flash up a slide very briefly to talk about some of the things I think we should be expecting to focus on and have a good expectation of helping, not necessarily getting rid of the problem altogether, but helping reduce the problem, soften the impact, reduce the severity of that symptom. Different aspects of sort of the psychiatric or psychological and behavioural aspects of the illness here, mood problems when they occur, but also some more physical aspects about sleep and continence, swallowing, nutrition, practical aspects of communication. Working out how the frontotemporal dementia complicates what we call comorbidity, which is other illnesses. Managing your diabetes with FTD is a very different thing from managing diabetes in an otherwise healthy person. And there's lots of issues around the legal and medical legal aspects of the illness. But around many of these, there's a role for pharmacology, trying to focus on what's actually a problem for the patient and what are the key things that present a real difficulty for the family or the carers with quite specific goals. And one of the things I tell our colleagues when I'm talking to doctors about this illness is actually, first of all, don't make things worse. There is a raft of medications that is very safe and well tolerated in healthy people, but can actually make frontotemporal dementia a lot worse. And I won't go through a long list here, but if you're supporting someone with frontotemporal dementia through other parts of the medical services with a GP or specialist, and they're talking about new medications, do make sure that person has thought about its connection to FTD. Now, there could be a urologist treating bladder symptoms or a cardiologist treating blood pressure, all sorts of things, not just brain tablets. They can have an impact on the FTD that need to be thought about carefully. So just to round off on treatments, I want to point a way forward to say that we are all looking for what I would call definitive, really effective ways to prevent and halt the dementia. And there's a range of methods. You can try and stop the buildup of that junk protein I talked about earlier. That would be one method, trying to stop these proteins getting sticky and claggy. You could perhaps use the brain's natural ways of clearing bad proteins to increase that normal sort of waste disposal system that brain cells have, to boost that, to help them clear these junk proteins. Another approach is to say, well, these proteins are okay if the brain cells can keep on working. None of us know how much tau I've got or how much TDP or amyloid. I don't really mind. What I do care about is my brain working. So there's a number of approaches now coming forward to make the cells in the brain tolerant of these changes so that one could live normally but for more years. And then perhaps the final group here is about these things called ASOs, which I know Lucy's going to talk about, which are like mini antidotes to DNA. So where there's a genetic fault underlying the FTD, one could give a little snippet of DNA as an antidote to block the effect of the bad gene. And all of the approaches that we've set out here on this slide are coming towards clinical trials in the next few years. Some are already in trials. So as I look ahead, I think FTD is a complex illness. It's as complex as human beings are, and it's as different for every patient as we are all different from each other. But if we think ahead, it's not just about if, but it's more about when we have a drug to treat FTD. And I would personally take the emphasis on cure but I think it is a really reasonable to think about stopping and halting and preventing the illness. To cure the illness, to get rid of it, to go back, wind the clock back as if it had never arrived, that I think is not on the cards anytime soon. But we should be aspiring, with the help from colleagues around the world and help from you and families with frontotemporal dementia, to think about progress towards stopping or halting the illness. So thank you for listening. I'm very happy to take questions in the sessions later on, or if people have questions they want to contact me directly, please do so. Thank you for listening. Please do so.
Hello, well, thank you very much, James. As he was just saying, James will be around in our question and answer session later on. For the sake of time, so that we have enough time to go through everyone's questions, let's move on to our next talk. So Lucy Russell is going to talk to us about where we are with treatment trials at the moment in frontotemporal dementia.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Lucy Russell and I've been working at the Dementia Research Centre for the last 6 years now on a number of FTD projects. My current role is working as the coordinator of the Frontotemporal Dementia Prevention Initiative, known as the FPI. The main goal of this initiative is to bring together FTD researchers from across the world to promote clinical trials of new FTD therapies. So today I'm going to talk to you about the clinical trials in FTD that are either underway or just about to begin. So I'm first going to give a quick review of the clinical trial process, and I will then go on to talk about the trials for genetic and then sporadic FTD. Some of this may be familiar to many of you, as I gave a talk back in September at one of the other FTD support groups, but hopefully there'll be some new interesting information in here as well. There are 5 phases of clinical trial. Firstly, there is the preclinical stage, in which the pharmaceutical company is developing their drug. Once the drug has been established and demonstrates that there is a good reason to believe that it may benefit people, which can sometimes take many years, it moves on to a phase 1 clinical trial. The phase 1 trial is made up of 2 parts. 1A is the first in human trial, usually given to healthy individuals, to ensure that there is not a detrimental effect. The second phase is a phase 1B, which is the first time it is given to the target population, so in our case, individuals at risk of or living with frontotemporal dementia. The aim of this phase is to determine the maximum dose required and lets us monitor the safety of the drug. It allows us to see how well individuals are coping with the drug and note any side effects that may occur. These trials are usually very short, from a number of days up to 8 weeks long, and only contain a very small number of participants, from 20 to 100 individuals. A phase 2 is a much larger trial, ranging from 100 to 300 participants. The aim of this phase is to establish if the drug works or not, while still monitoring the safety and side effects of the drug. This phase can take around 1 to 6 months to complete. Up to and including this phase, the entrance criteria for the trials are often very strict. Phase 3 is the pivotal study. This is where we are able to establish on a much larger scale, at around 300 to 1,000 participants, whether or not the drug will be successful. There are many different factors that must be considered for a drug to be seen as successful, and it can often take many years to establish this, and the results of the trial must be approved by a regulatory authority. So if the drug is approved for use, it will be licensed and distributed to the target population, but individuals will continue to be monitored in a phase 4 observational style study. The process for developing therapeutic drugs for FTD is very difficult, and this is due to the complex and varied presentations of the symptoms. There are a variety of distinct and overlapping features of FTD, which include behaviour and language symptoms, as well as movement and neuropsychiatric symptoms, to name just a few. This can often mean that it takes an individual a long time to be given the correct diagnosis, and this isn't helped either, as there are many different biological processes going on in the body that we're currently unable to measure during life, unlike in Alzheimer's disease. So one way to tackle this problem is to look at individuals with genetic causes of FTD. In around 30 to 50% of individuals who develop FTD, there is a known genetic cause for the condition, so the new therapeutic drugs can be specific to the genetic problem. There are 3 main genes that we know cause FTD. and these are chromosome 9, open reading frame 72, known as C9orf72 or C9, microtubule-associated protein tau, referred to as MAPT, and progranulin or GRN. There are also a number of other rarer genes, but we are currently unable to study these as there are so few individuals across the world who carry them. At the moment, there are two different types of drugs being used to develop treatments for genetic causes of FTD. The first are a group of gene therapies, one of which is an antisense oligonucleotide, and the other an adeno-associated virus. The second group of drugs are called monoclonal antibodies. It's possible that in the future, these might not be the only two drugs used to treat FTD, but so far, focus is on these two types. So let's start with gene therapy. Gene therapy aims to treat a specific disease at the cause of the problem by introducing, removing, or modifying genetic material called DNA or RNA in a person's cell. So let's first recap these terms. So DNA is the blueprint of our existence. It gives the body the instructions it needs to make us who we are, and is made up of these two very long strands that you can see on the screen here. It can be found within the nucleus, which is the centre of our cells, and on these long strands of DNA, smaller sections make up specific genes. And inside the centre of the cell, the gene can be copied to produce something called RNA. The RNA is then able to leave the centre of the cell, and once outside, it makes proteins. Now, proteins have the instructions from our DNA to make our bodies work properly. They're able to move around our bodies and go to where they are needed. However, in FTD, as we know, some of our genes aren't working correctly. So this causes things to go wrong when the proteins are being made, which ends up causing the symptoms we see in FTD. It is possible, however, that we can use gene therapy to help resolve these problems. So firstly, let's take a look at how antisense oligonucleotides can help. In the case of C9orf72 and MAPT, the proteins that are created are bad for us and can be toxic, and this leads to the development of symptoms. It is possible that if we were able to stop the bad proteins from being made at either this copying stage here or the time at which the proteins are made, we will be able to stop these bad proteins from causing problems. And this is what antisense oligonucleotides do. They prevent the bad or toxic proteins from being made, and so are sometimes called gene silencing drugs because of this. We have two companies that are developing ASOs, and this is Wave Life Sciences and Biogen. Biogen are currently using this type of drug in a group of individuals with motor neurone disease or amyloid lateral sclerosis, and these individuals all carry the C9orf72 expansion. We're awaiting the results of this study until we know if they will be taking it forward in individuals with frontotemporal dementia who also have C9orf72 expansions. Wave are about to start a phase 1 trial in the next few months. The trial will consist of a single dose of an ASO, and individuals will be monitored over 12 weeks. It will include individuals with only mild symptoms. With regard to those individuals with MAPT mutations, Biogen has an ASO drug that is ready to go into a trial, but we're working with them to determine the type of trial that is used. Now, in traditional trials, you have two groups. You have the one who receives the drug and the one who does not. They often receive something that looks the same as the drug, but it actually has no effect, and this is called the placebo group. Neither the researchers nor the participants know which group the participants are in, as the individuals are randomly assigned by the pharmacist. Usually, there are an equal number of participants in each group. Now, if we wanted to test more than one drug, this doubles the number of participants that are required to go into the trials. And not only that, it also doubles the number of people who are not receiving the active treatment, but rather on the placebo. So this limits the number of people potentially benefiting from the new therapy. This is a problem in MAPT as the mutations are so rare compared to the other two groups, and so there may not actually be enough individuals across the world to test two drugs. And we don't want to pin all our hopes on just one drug in case it doesn't work for some reason. So one way around this problem is to use a platform trial. This enables us to test more than one drug at a time, whilst reducing the number of people who do not receive the active drug and are on the placebo. We're currently in talks with Biogen at the moment about the feasibility of a platform trial with them, and are trying to find more centres around the world who see individuals with MAPT mutations to try and boost the number of potential participants that could go into a trial. We will be looking to gain funding for this type of trial over the next year, and we are hopeful that we will be able to bring on board at least one other company to try another drug for MAPT mutation carriers. So moving on to the second type of gene therapy, and this is known as adeno-associated viruses. And this is being used to treat individuals with progranulin mutation. So this time, instead of the gene producing the bad protein, like in MAPT or C9orf72, we know that the progranulin gene produces very little of the progranulin protein, which causes the FTD symptoms, because there isn't enough of it in the body. This type of therapy overcomes this problem by placing the working version of the gene into a virus. This doesn't make us ill at all, as the harmful content of the virus is removed. The virus is used as it is easily able to enter the body without too much difficulty. This allows the virus to be injected into the body and take the working version of the gene into the brain cell. And this therefore gives the genetic instructions to be copied by RNA. The RNA can then leave the centre of the cell and makes the correct protein. The new genetic information provided by the virus doesn't alter our original DNA. It just sits within the centre of the cell. And so it means that this type of treatment can last for many years with only one dose of the drug being given. We have two companies that are aiming to use this technology, Prevail and Passage Bio, with the Prevail trial already underway after they dosed their first participant back in December in the US. We will be recruiting to the Prevail trial at UCL shortly, and we'll be able to include individuals who have mild symptoms and know they carry the progranulin mutation. As these will be phase 1b trials, they will only require a few participants at each of the sites to make sure the drug is safe and well tolerated. We hope that Passage Bio's trial will be starting by the end of the year. So moving on to the next type of treatment for genetic FTD, and this is monoclonal antibodies. In our bodies, we have things called antibodies, which are part of our immune system. They recognise and fight off foreign objects that enter our bodies, and these foreign objects are called antigens. Antibodies are produced by the cells in our immune system. So what are monoclonal antibodies then? The word mono means single, and the word clonal means clone. So a monoclonal antibody are lots of the same identical antibodies from a single immune cell. And this is perfect, as to work properly, we need large numbers of these identical antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies have a high specificity, which means that they can only recognise and bind to one single antigen binding site, which is a key trait in diagnosing and treating diseases. So when we apply this mechanism to progranulin, we know that the body is not making enough progranulin protein. And we also know that there is another protein in the body called sortilin that breaks down progranulin as part of the body's natural process. If we were to stop this process, we may be able to increase the levels of progranulin in the body back to normal levels in the hope that this will alleviate or slow down the FTD symptoms. And this is what a company called Electa have done. They have developed a monoclonal antibody called AL001, which binds to the antigen sortilin, and this stops it from binding to progranulin and breaking it down, therefore increasing the levels of progranulin in the body. The drug is administered via intravenous injection into the bloodstream every 4 weeks. Electa are about to start their phase 3 trial, as their phase 1 and 2 results were very promising. In their phase 1 trial, they indicated that not only was the drug safe and well tolerated, with very few side effects, they were also able to see an increase in progranulin levels, as well as a dose level effect. Now this means that by increasing the amount of drug given, higher levels of progranulin were seen at the end of the trial, and you can see this by the increase in the bars in the image on the right. These results were also very similar in their preliminary stage 2 results, and so they're moving on with their phase 3 trial. They're recruiting individuals who know they carry the progranulin mutation and are including both symptomatic individuals as well as those without symptoms. We're about to start recruitment of this trial at UCL within the next few weeks, and we will start the trial once the COVID restrictions have been lifted. So to summarise, we have two types of treatments for genetic FTD at present. The first are made up of gene therapies, adeno-associated viruses and antisense oligonucleotides, and the second type of therapies are monoclonal antibodies. So in comparison to genetic FTD, the development of therapeutic drugs in sporadic FTD is much harder, and this is because we don't know what is causing the problem. And in addition to this, there are a number of different clinical presentations. For example, behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia, primary progressive aphasia, progressive supranuclear palsy, and cortical basal syndrome. And unfortunately, we're unable to measure what's going wrong in the brain during life. But we can actually look at which of these proteins are present in someone's brain after they have passed away. And what this teaches us is that there are three groups of proteins found in the brain of individuals with sporadic FTD. And these are called tau, TDP43, and FET. Now, in behavioural variant FTD, we know that people can have any one of these three different types of proteins in their brain. For those with primary progressive aphasia or cortical basal syndrome, we can find either tau or TDP43 proteins. But for PSP, there is actually only one protein found in the brain, and that is tau. Now, this is really important because it means that we know that a problem with tau is causing the symptoms that we see in PSP during life. However, for the other different clinical syndromes, we can't be certain which of these proteins we will find. Typically, tau is a helpful protein in the brain as it helps to give it structure and stability. But for some reason, it can sometimes go wrong and it breaks up in the brain and it all gets tangled together. And it's these tangles that cause the symptoms to develop by damaging the brain cells. So to start trials in sporadic FTD, many pharmaceutical companies have focused on PSP because they can be sure of the mechanism that is causing the symptoms, which is tau. Now, a company called UCB Pharmaceuticals have developed a monoclonal antibody to target tau in the brain. Now, this type of drug can be used in this case because the monoclonal antibodies work at the protein level, as I previously discussed, and not at the genetic level. And they also have this high specificity, which means they will only bind to one target. And in this case, it will be tau. The idea is that the monoclonal antibody UCB0107 will bind to tau, which in this case is the antigen. The hope is that it will prevent tau from building up in the brain cells, and instead the antibody will ensure that the problem tau will be removed from the brain so it does not cause any symptoms. This study is a phase 1 study, so it's the first in the human and patient population. They have finished recruitment and we are awaiting the results of this trial. It is possible that if this drug works at slowing or preventing symptoms in PSP, then it may be a candidate for other FTD syndromes, in which tau also builds up in the brain. Now, of course, we need to know which of these individuals have problems with tau during life, and which we currently are unable to do. So it's really important that we continue to develop tools that can tell us which proteins are building up in the brain. And we will carry on with this work to develop these tools through our observational research projects here at UCL. So that's the Longitudinal Investigation of Frontotemporal Dementia, known as LIFT, and the Genetic Frontotemporal Dementia Initiative project known as GEMFI. We'll also continue to work on clinical trials for all syndromes and all genetic causes through the Frontotemporal Dementia Prevention Initiative, with researchers, pharmaceutical companies and consortium groups from across the world coming together. So thank you all very much for listening today. I know that many of you have already expressed an interest in taking part in some of these clinical trials, but if you do not think that we have you on our list, please do get in touch with either myself or Dr. Rowe to let us know you would like to participate in the clinical trials. You can also find out more information about the FPI or the current trials at the FPI website, as well as at FTD Talk. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram for more informal and regular updates on all things FTD. Finally, I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all of those individuals and their families, both past and present, who are involved in our observational and clinical trials. Your time and dedication to this cause is so precious, and we really could not do it without you. So thank you all very much. I know it's been a really tough year for everyone, and many of you have missed out on attending your research visits. But hopefully these will be back up and running in the next month or so, and so we'll be in touch shortly and hopefully seeing many of you soon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to Lucy, and I can see already that lots of questions coming in around those trials and things that are happening in the treatment sphere, but we can come to those at the end. So moving on, we are very privileged to have Linda Brown here, who will tell you her story, but has been the carer for somebody with frontotemporal dementia, and I'll let her introduce herself and tell her experience.
Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here with you on the annual seminar for FTD 2021. I'm delighted to be joined by Linda Brown today. Linda, it's lovely to see you here, and thank you so much for joining us today. Linda, unfortunately, you lost your husband James last year. Could you tell us a little bit about the background with James, please?
Good afternoon, Nikki and everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me here. Yes, James was a kind, intelligent, generous guy, very good at languages, really quick wit, and a very good sense of humour. He was 10 years older than me. We were married for almost 50 years. And he'd been a merchant seaman, a linguist in the RAF, and a money dealer, and we met at work. So last April, at the height of the pandemic, James was taken into hospital. He slipped off his chair, and I called the ambulance. They came and found his blood sugar was really high. So they had to take him into hospital without me, and I never saw him again. He caught COVID while he was in the hospital, and I never got to see him before or after. 10 days later, he died. We had a web-streamed funeral, which actually worked out really well for us. Because I could invite people from all over the world to join us on screen, and that really worked well. So yeah, like so many other people, it was tough. It was tough. I mean, he was 80. He had he was diabetic type 2, had low thyroid and FTD. So that was, it was tough.
I'm sorry you've had such a hard year. I'm really sort of sorry, and really appreciate you coming to share your experience today with us. Can you tell us a bit sort of about in the beginning about when you first noticed some changes with James?
Yeah, the changes were really subtle to start off with. It was personality, change in personality. And then I noticed he was buying a lot online. It was quite obsessive, really. I was joking that he was trying to keep eBay in business. At one point we had 7 fountains in our small garden. They're only small fountains, and he installed them. Nevertheless, it was rather odd, let's say that, very odd. In 2015, I was visiting family abroad. He stayed home. When I returned, he was very confused, and I thought, it might be UTI. And then I found out that he'd actually sold his much loved top of the range car for something much smaller, and I was shocked. That was strange as well. Then I noticed in 2016 that he started to have a little dents in his car, and he was taking it down the local shop to get it sorted. And then I didn't travel with him very often in the car, but when I did, I noticed that he was going too near to the parked cars, so that was a little bit scary. And then in 2017, he was going to his tap class, and he didn't come back at the time that I expected him to. So I had to report him missing because he'd not come back. And I guess that maybe he'd had an accident. Well, he hadn't at that time, but the time the police got here, he actually had the accident. Luckily, nobody else was injured, but he was taken to A&E and he had a CAT scan. And then they thought it was, his confusion was probably caused by a UTI again. But they did say to me, could you make an appointment at the memory clinic so they can do some further tests just in case. Surrendering his driving license was really difficult, because it meant his independence had gone completely. When we went to the memory clinic, he had an MRI, and the diagnosis was given as mild cognitive impairment. Within a year, things had progressed. I'd made a note before we went back to the memory clinic of my concerns, basically. Things had changed. And soon after, they said that it was possibly FTD. And that was that. Okay.
A long time sort of to get there, and sort of through different sort of real crises and issues sort of going on. Yes. Oh dear, yeah. Now it is quite complex, as you said, because James did have diabetes type 2, and this made it quite difficult with his obsession with sweet food as well. Can you sort of tell us a bit about this sort of impact with that?
Yeah, absolutely. After 10 years really of excellent diabetes control, which he did himself, obviously, he started eating lots of sweet things. I found chocolate wrappers in his pockets and things like that when he popped out to the shops. And then in social situations, it was really difficult because as soon as I turned my head, he'd grab sugar, put it in his tea, and if there were any cakes or biscuits on offer, he'd make a play for them and grab them. I had to take them away in the end, and he couldn't understand why at that point. He wasn't able to understand the value of blood sugar control. So it was very difficult in social circumstances. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time I felt like Joyce Grenfell saying, James, don't do that. But he by that time he just wanted them, and that was it really, But restricting his food as well. I wanted to give him what he wanted to eat, but I was really worried about the complications of diabetes, even diabetes type 2. We didn't know how long this was going to go on for, and obviously, I was very mindful of that really. I wanted to avoid it.
Difficult, isn't it? Definitely, yes. So I remember talking to you a little while ago, and I really loved sort of all the strategies that you come up with to engage James. But it wasn't just engaging him; you were having real fun. Can you sort of share some of the sort of strategies and tips and the experiences that you had together?
Yeah, I always thought I was a really patient person until I met FTD and became a sole carer. And then obviously, it's difficult. And I soon realised really that when caring for a spouse, not only do you lose, you watch them deteriorate, you actually see your own life deteriorating in front of you. And that's really difficult. We had good emotional support from family and our children, but unfortunately none of them lived nearby, so they weren't able to give me a hand. Friends kept their distance, and then I realised actually that it was down to me to do something about it, really. So as our world became smaller, I realised that I had to adapt my expectations, and that things that I always thought were really important actually weren't important at all. Firstly, I tried to focus on things that we had in common, which were music, dancing and singing. As his behaviour became more childlike, I thought the techniques that I used to use with the children, and thought that I should try some of those out. A few examples really. I created, first of all, a playlist of positive songs that we both liked, and then I used those to divert his attention when he was showering and dressing. That worked really well. We would join in together singing them, and that really helped. It really did. Then I found simple clapping games really worked as well, because he was able to do that really well. I started off really slow and soft, and then I became louder and faster, and we always collapsed in a heap of laughter, because it was mad, but it worked, and it sort of stimulated him in a way. I like that. I like doing that. We watched lots of DVDs of our favourite musicals and things, and that was great. One thing that was really good was I found my children's old Magna Doodle board, and that was really, really successful, because he was able to draw. He liked drawing, but he was able to draw, make patterns, write rude words on there, and he was able to erase them. He had control over that, and it was something really that I think was really good to see him in control of that, whereas so many other things, you know, he wasn't anymore. So that was really good. But I have to say that being a carer to a loved one, to a spouse, really was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, and I failed often. But I did my best, and that's all you can do. But now I'm so pleased that I did it. I'm so pleased that we walked along together on the FTD journey.
That's really, really lovely to hear, and so inspiring. But looking back, do you think now sort of that, you know, more help and support would have been beneficial at the time for you?
I was very reluctant to get paid carers in to start off with. You know, I thought I could do it myself, but obviously no way. So eventually I was struggling, needed help. I tried to raise awareness of FTD wherever I could, because I realised that so many professionals even have no idea about the condition. They really haven't. So I even found that I went to some care homes to try and get respite, and asked about FTD, and one care home said, "Oh yes, one of our nurses knows about FTD." I was quite shocked actually, because they had no idea the complexities that it involved, none at all. So you know, and I think really the initiative is really important to raise education in all quarters. I think it's really necessary and really important. In the end, I got respite by taking him to daycare centres. In the end, he went to 4 days a week. They loved him. Yeah, they really loved him, because he was able to do things that the others couldn't do if they had Alzheimer's and things, you know. He could answer the questions in the quizzes and things. They also loved that his appetite was so good. And I was continually explaining to them that it was because he had FTD, but they were so kind, they were so caring, but they really, some of them did not understand the complexities of it. They really didn't. But you know, the fact that they were so kind to him was really important to me. And they danced, and he loved to dance, so that was excellent, really. Yeah, so that was it, really. It worked for me.
It sounds like he had lots of fun, and he must have been an absolute joy for them to have in the day centres as well. Absolutely. Now, you're involved in a lot of support groups now and platforms, aren't you? Can you tell us a little bit about these different ones?
Yeah, when James was at the daycare centre, I helped a friend set up a dementia choir. And I'm still doing that on Zoom, and that's absolutely brilliant, really important. Really, singing is just so important. I joined the Facebook FTD spouse group. That was very good. That was quite late in my journey, actually, but I'd gained a lot of knowledge. Quite harrowing, because some of obviously we were all at different stages, but it was a real source of education, really, experiences. Then we came to do a little bit of research with Jonathan and his team, and that was really good. One funny moment with Caroline, when he couldn't believe his luck that all these lovely, beautiful girls were coming to take his arm and escorting him off to do some tests. With Caroline, she took his arm and they walked down the corridor, and he started to sing the wedding march, which was just so funny. And then he turned to her and said, I don't think much of your bouquet. And she was carrying a file. I mean, it was just funny. You had to be there, but it was really funny. It was really funny. I think the new support groups and the new forum that RDS are actually trying to set up will be really, really useful. Really useful, because a lot of the people on the FTD spouse, they're actually in America, so it is slightly different, but nevertheless, it was really beneficial to me.
And finally, you've got some great self-care tips, haven't you? Some strategies that you do for yourself now as a bereaved carer. I just think they're absolutely wonderful. I really do. So can you share some of these with our members today?
Right. Well, first of all, I realised that the hardest thing to get through after a bereavement is first anniversaries, Christmas, birthdays, Valentine's Day, all difficult. Everyone finds it really difficult, but I've really learned on my journey that gratitude helps heal grief, and I really do believe that does. And although I'm still doing the grief cha-cha, which is 1 step forward, 3 back, fairly often, I feel grateful for the happy times that we had together over 50 years. And you know, I decided that I wasn't going to be sad about them. I was going to try and be grateful and put that in place, really. So trying to promote the good memories to get over the difficult days, I decided to celebrate them in my own way. So what I did was I put photos of past events on my Facebook page, videos of him doing tap dancing in little concerts, of him being Elvis, and that really helped to share my grief with friends that probably didn't know that side of him. You know, we all know different sides of people. And then the big one really was the golden wedding. We almost got to the golden wedding, 49 years, 7 months. And I decided I couldn't be sad about that. I had to be grateful. So I decided to call it my almost golden wedding anniversary, and I ordered a balloon, 50 years together, and then some mugs with 50 years of love, which was true, a card, and then my daughter came over and we sat in the garden with a photo of James, and drank Prosecco, and then I put photos of past anniversaries on my timeline again, on my Facebook page, and that really worked for me. And I've mentioned that to lots of people on the. I'm now a member of the FTD survivors, the next chapter group. That's Facebook, and I've suggested that loads of people do that for birthdays as well. And actually that's worked really well, because people have come back and said it got me through the day. And really that's the most important thing, is that you can get through it without the sadness. Of course it is sad that they're not with you, but I also bought myself a present as well on the various events, and said to James's photo, you know, this is from you, and it helps. Likewise is what I call the empty chair syndrome, where a lot of people say that they look at the empty chair and they feel really sad about it. But I decided from day one that I was going to sit in his chair as well. So it not only became his chair, it became our chair. And there again, I mentioned that to quite a few people, and other people had said actually that they were doing a similar thing, that they were sitting in their partner's or spouse's chair, and that it helped them. But it's a simple thing, but actually to look out the window and see the view that he had, I never realised that, because I'd not sat in this chair before. So that was a revelation in itself, to be honest. All those simple things help, and it is getting through it. I love helping with the dementia choir. That is really inspirational, and we do chair exercise and bingo now, and helping others really helps me. That's the bottom line, really.
That's brilliant. Well, I'm sure your words of wisdom have been a great help to everybody listening today. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing the experiences, and it's just so lovely to hear about James, and listening to the empty chair. I'm sure you felt you could have stole that chair years ago and got what he was getting from it.
Exactly.
Linda is going to be on our panel with me later for the Q&A sessions, so please do send some questions in now, and we'll be filtering them through for a bit later. Thank you again, Linda.
I'd just like to add actually that I believe that everyone's story is important, and sharing experiences and hearing other people's journeys are vitally important for me. But sadly, not everyone wants to hear them. When I found attending the RDS Carers Bereavement Group, I knew straight away that Seb and his team were genuinely interested and really care about all of our experiences. I think that is absolutely incredible, and it makes it very special, very special. Thank you. Special. Very special.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you for joining us later. A really powerful story, and we really value people coming and telling us about their lived experience, and we recognise it can be difficult, but I think I agree with what you said at the end, that you know, hearing that experience from others that have lived it, it really is hugely helpful. When we start the question and answers, I'll introduce the whole panel, but you saw Nikki Zimmermann there interviewing Linda, and before we go on to the next talk, just a brief minute to remind people that this group is run through Rare Dementia Support. We've actually run an FTD support group for many years, but it's come under the auspices of this relatively new group, Rare Dementia Support, which encompasses a set of support groups for rare forms of dementia. These support groups over the years have been very much the way that we've connected people together. But as you heard from Linda, we have expanded the services that we offer, and I'll ask Nikki to briefly just talk about some of the small groups that we now have, and you heard about the bereaved carers group there from Linda. You'll hear from a couple of people that really help us in the RDS in the panel, but next we'll hear from Michael Marshall, who'll tell us a little bit about legal aspects, and I'll pick up with some of the questions that you've sent in at the end. But it's been really helpful to get much more expertise on the key questions that many of you want to ask, and so we're very grateful to have this kind of expertise come and be part of the RDS. So I'll leave that to Michael, and then we'll pick things up again during the Q&A session.
Hello, my name is Michael Marshall, and I'm a training solicitor at the UCO Integrated Legal Advice Clinic, and I'm going to talk to you about the Rare Dementia Support Advice Service. The three things that we'll be looking at today are the clinic where I work, the ILAC, UCL ILAC, then the advice service itself, what we offer, and then we'll be looking at some of the common legal problems that RDS members often come to us with. The UCL Integrated Legal Advice Clinic, or UCL ILAC, is part of the UCL Faculty of Laws, and specifically it's based within the Centre for Access to Justice. The centre was set up a few years ago by a woman called Dame Hazel Genn, who is a legal academic who's done a lot of research into socio-legal issues, and in particular, the interaction of health problems and legal problems. We're based in an office in Stratford, in East London, and we offer advice on social welfare issues. So that's generally helping people access housing, community care and social care and welfare benefits. We also do some education work as well. Aside from the advice that we offer students clinical legal education. So students who are studying at UCL are able to come and volunteer or study with us and learn about social problems and how they interact with the law. They also get an understanding of these social welfare areas of law that they might not experience in the lecture hall. And they get a practical experience of the law. They learn about how the law actually works in practice rather than just in textbooks and in cases that they read. Finally, we do a lot of research. As I mentioned earlier, Hazel Genn has done a lot of research on health and the law, and we've also done some research into what are called health justice partnerships. So the RDS advice service has been running since 2018, and it's open to all RDS members. We offer free and confidential advice and information on any legal issue whatsoever. We do only offer generalist advice. So that means that if there is a specific problem or a problem that requires specific or detailed legal advice, we're not able to advise on it, or at least we would signpost you to other organisations or law firms that do have the expertise to give full advice on that matter. The advice that we provide is supported by master's students at the Faculty of Laws. And they'll do much of the research that takes place before the appointment. They often tend to take part in the appointment, taking notes, and then they will put together, help put together correspondence that's sent out following the appointment. Unfortunately, we're not able to offer ongoing casework. We can only offer one-off advice, although RDS members are free to come back as many times as they like. So in addition to the advice that we offer, we also are putting together public legal education resources. So advice and information. We also put together public legal education resources, so bits of information that the general public can access on specific issues. So at the moment we are working on videos that will explain in some detail how to access NHS continuing healthcare, how to access disability and carer benefits, and also problems that often arise with probate and administration of estate. Some of the problems that typically come up, or RDS members come to us with often, are issues surrounding accessing welfare benefits, accessing social care, and in particular NHS continuing healthcare, making complaints to local authorities or to the local government and social care ombudsman, lasting power of attorney and deputyships, court of protection proceedings, and sale of property and care home fees. But we are, as I said, able to offer advice and information on anything whatsoever. So other issues that we've come up against to do with employment, often people who are trying to get insurers to pay out salary protection schemes is something else that we've had a bit of experience doing. But really, it could be anything whatsoever. And although the advice that we give is generalist, many people find it helpful just to come and bounce their own ideas off of us to make sure that the research that they're doing is perhaps heading in the right direction, and to get some advice on other things that they might want to take into consideration. Also, because we have a lot of experience doing this, then we're able to signpost in the direction of other organisations that possibly have the expertise to give full advice on that particular matter. So if you do have any issue that you'd like to talk to us about, please feel free to get in touch. As I said, the service is completely free and confidential, so there's no harm whatsoever in speaking to us and seeing if it's something that we can help with. the best way to contact us is through our email address, which is down below there, caj.rdsas@ucl.ac.uk. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I can already see there are a number of questions heading your way, Michael, about things. So really thank you to every one of our speakers today. We're in this strange world of virtual meetings, and I know from experience, having given many talks over 20 years, that it can still be quite odd and strange to give a talk over the internet virtually. So very kind of everybody to speak, and we all heard lots of different things from the speakers, and hopefully can pick up on some of the aspects that came up on the Q&A session. So I'd like to invite everybody on. So if we can get everyone's camera and microphone on who's going to be on the panel. And thank you to everyone. And so we have all of the speakers. So James Rowe, Lucy Russell, Linda Brown, thank you very much, and Michael Marshall. We also have Nikki Zimmermann, who I'm going to ask to just speak in a second, who is the lead for our direct support team at RDS, and many of you will have been in contact if you've joined the group. But also I want to thank Tricia O'Hara, who's our rights and entitlements support worker, who's been really helpful. Many of you who've attended the previous FTD support group meetings will have seen Trish talk before, and I'm sure many of you will have questions that Trish will be able to help with. So that's our sort of growing team at the RDS. But Nikki, just because it came up, I wonder whether just a quick word about the sort of expansion of the RDS and some of the small groups that you've been running.
Yeah, so over the past year, it's been really difficult for us because we've not been able to meet you, and difficult for you because you haven't been able to see us. So we've been trying to do as much as possible online. We realised that one of the issues come about with not having the physical groups is you've not been able to meet each other. So last year we decided to put together some small groups. So we have different sort of topics for different stages, hoping to meet as many types of needs as possible out there. And these are small groups of in between 6 and 12 people within the groups. And the topics are for late stage carers, or pre-bereavement grief, or early stages for advanced care planning and knowing all the health professionals are, or for looking at sort of empowering your identity, especially if you've had a new diagnosis. So we've been running these groups sort of periodically. We've just in the middle or nearly finishing our third phase, and we'll be planning to do some more a little bit later in the year. So we're looking at sort of themes and topics and what would be really most important for people to sort of bridge that gap until we can meet again physically. And even when we can meet again physically, it's been amazing running these small groups as webinars, how geography doesn't come into it at all. We've been so overwhelmed with how many people want to join them and from where. We've had people in our groups from Australia, from Canada, from Singapore, and sort of all over the UK. So it's really been an absolute pleasure to be able to bring together people like this. Thank you.
And I think it's probably fair to say, Nikki, that you know, the RDS has really expanded over the years, and thanks to Trish and Michael as well, and all the rest of your team. Nikki has a whole team of people, many of whom you, Claire and Livy and Alicia, who you will have been in contact with. But we really are still very much open to people's ideas about what you want to get out of this this group and what you want to get out of the RDS in general. So we're always very happy. Nikki would be very happy to hear from people. So I'm going to start with some clinical questions, and I think a helpful one that James, I would ask you, which is something that I think we get asked commonly, which is what's the difference between behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia and an atypical form of Alzheimer's disease where you have so-called frontal variant Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah. So often when diseases have their typical appearance, it's very easy to pick them apart. People with typical Alzheimer's disease and thinks of memory being the hallmark of that. Whatever else comes along, memory is at the heart of the problem. But there are times when Alzheimer's disease doesn't just start in the memory centers of the brain, but starts elsewhere. And there's several examples of this. One is when it starts up at towards the sort of the side and the back of the brain, and it causes an illness called posterior cortical atrophy, which the IDS group will be familiar with. And this is made famous by Terry Pratchett. It was his version of Alzheimer's disease, giving problems with orientation, how you see the world, not memory as such, but how the brain sees the world. If the Alzheimer's disease, as the disease settles a little bit further down in the brain, it can affect language. So when I mentioned that logopenic version of frontotemporal dementia, where the mental dictionary is lost, that actually turns out to be a variant of Alzheimer's disease rather than have much in common with the rest of the FTD family of illnesses. But so it can settle at the top at the back to do with vision and seeing, lower down language. But a third form is if it settles in the front of the brain. So the Alzheimer's disease biology starts off in the front of the brain. It can cause an illness that looks a little bit like frontotemporal dementia. And that sometimes used to be called the frontal variant of Alzheimer's disease. Actually, the more people see of it, it is a bit different from frontotemporal dementia. There's more memory involved, and there's a bit more disorganized thinking. But some of those more challenging social behaviors tend not to occur. So it's sometimes called frontal variant Alzheimer's disease. Often it might be better to call it a behavioral or dysexecutive form of Alzheimer's disease. If you look closely, a good psychologist, a good memory clinic would usually be able to pick it apart. So that's how I'd say it. And it's quite an important difference because how you might treat it will be very different. Are the anti-Alzheimer drugs likely to be helpful? Yes, broadly for the frontal Alzheimer's disease. No, for frontotemporal dementia. So it certainly makes a difference for treatment. And it brings in a whole set of differences about genetic risk, family inheritance, what the future might hold in store. So it is quite a big difference to get right.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and it's something that we perhaps diagnose a little bit more in the days where people have more detailed tests that come to clinic and have spinal fluid or PET scans, which we may not have done 5 or 10 years ago. I've got a couple of questions about specific symptoms, which are sort of open to everyone. The first question comes from someone who says, I understand that behaviours in FTD can't be controlled, but why is it my husband is obsessive and difficult to manage behaviours when he's around me, but not in front of other people? I might start with you again, James, just at this point.
Yes, Philip, I was looking to Linda as the real expert on this. We hear and see this a lot. I think in life, people close to us often get the brunt of our bad mood. I'm grumpy with the kids and my wife than I would probably be in clinic. There is an extent to which, our behaviours, even in normal health, vary. And this is perhaps magnified in the early years with frontotemporal dementia. And we hear this time and time again. The positive side is perhaps people feel more relaxed at home, more relaxed in order to express agitation, distress, confusion, or more difficult, more bad behaviours, disruptive OCDs. People might be more relaxed, and if with strangers or if with people you know less well, for a short time and at a price of that effort and cost and energy required, people can cover it up for a bit. But back home, take a deep breath, out it all comes. But I don't know whether, Linda, you might have experienced this. You didn't describe this aspect with James's illness, but it is something we hear time and time again, and it can add to the frustration unless you can find a way to accommodate it and perhaps turn it around with some joy and some humour that you described so clearly.
Yeah, if I can say, he wanted to impress professionals. For example, when we saw Jonathan, when we came for research, because he'd been a Russian linguist in the RAF. He answered one of Jonathan's questions in Russian, which was odd, but and then on other occasions, when I had somebody in to check him, like some social occupational therapists and things, and I was telling them about a problem, he would, one example was he on the bed, he would put his head down, and it like a yoga pose, but he wanted to stay there, and I was concerned about that. And when the occupational therapist came, I said to them, you know, obviously that's not a good idea for him to stay like that for a long time. And I said, show them how you do that. And of course he got on the bed and put his head behind his hands, and perfect. But obviously he was trying to impress her that that was the normal thing to do. He knew, but it's acting it out on the short term. And obviously, you know, that is true, that you do see that an awful lot, trying to impress somebody to make them think that he wasn't as bad as he was.
And I think that's right. Often short term, we're very lucky, our appointment's about an hour and a half, and we often see in the first 5 or 10 minutes, the person with the illness holds it together and has a very effective front. It's superficial, looks like, but the longer you go on, it can only be sustained for so much time, and then it becomes all too obvious that there are quite serious problems going on. So that,
yeah, definitely.
Great. I'm going to ask a little bit about a couple of questions about dealing with these kind of behaviours. So people's thoughts about the best way of dealing with obsessive and disinhibited behaviours, and in particular one question, which is a very specific one about someone who compulsively spits. Who would like to start? I'll leave that a bit more open. James?
I can make a start. So we do see this. I don't see it very often. This last year, it's been a special challenge. Obviously, in the COVID, spitting has been a particularly stressful thing to have to accompany. So, with I suppose first thing is always try to see think through, are there situations when it makes it worse? People being company that's either stressful or agitated. You know, is there a way that producing a less stressful or less unpredictable environment might help reduce the behaviour? Is the spitting a substitute for speaking? It depends. Some people use spitting almost like a bad stutter. It then becomes a habit where they could be spitting. If so, try and think of other ways of communicating just to get around the problem. There are sometimes to work out, is it a true medical health problem, or am I, as the carer, feeling disgusted by it? Try and work through which is that, and then that might give you a way into different ways to solve it. You know, where is the problem? Is it that there are behaviours where they're very disruptive if we choose to let it, and are we embarrassed? Do we find it disgusting because of how someone else, a friend or someone in the street or shop, might think of it? Try and work out why it is such a problem. That might lead to different solutions. There can be simple practical things like we now see in the COVID era, these masks, a little headband with a sheet of perspex. That stops the spit going anywhere. So it stops it being such a health risk for others, and that might allow you to relax and be more confident about having other people around. Is it about communication? Is it from anxiety? Is it about stutter? All these different causes that might allow a way in to reduce the consequences of that spitting, the consequences for distress or the consequences on health.
I think that's helpful. Thank you, James. Yeah. Nikki and Trish, maybe just in general, we've talked just for new people who've not been before, we often talk about distraction and other things. I don't know if one of you wants to comment. Yeah, Trish.
I think as well, it might be worth always doing a review of medication just to see if there's any medicine that might be creating a horrible taste in the mouth. I think it's always wise to try to kind of eradicate causes, as obviously as James was talking about, look at the medical causes. Or if somebody is trying to get someone's attention. I think, you know, a lot of the time people maybe aren't looked at who have any differences, particularly if their behaviour is really erratic. So we tend maybe not to look at them, to set them off, or members of the public avoid catching their eye, and family maybe make a distance from them, and friends very much so, as Linda pointed out. Friends do step back at times of really significant illness. I think that's very noticeable and very commonplace. So I think sometimes people might do something because they just want someone to know they're there. You know, I'm here, please look at me, please take notice. So there might be some form of protest in it. It's trying, as James said, looking, you know, professionally we used to use, and we still use, things called ABC charts. What was happening before, just before it started happening, how did it happen, in what way? Was it lots, or was it just a one-off, you know, a little bit of spit or lots of spit? Was it playing with spit, or was it throwing the spit away? Was it slightly different spitting, because there'll be different people doing it? And what happened afterwards? Did people get angry? Did people walk away? Did the person seem to forget it happened? Did you respond? How did you respond? If you make a record of that, maybe over a couple of weeks, you might find some of the techniques that work that you didn't notice at the time, they did work. But, you know, having somebody have a flannel that they can spit into, which at least makes other people feel more comfortable, so that you're not asking them not to spit, but you're helping them spit safely. I think sometimes you just have to work with the situation rather than trying to stop it.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Trish. And I think, you know, for those of you that have been to many meetings before, I think, you know, as James said, sometimes it's about is this a behaviour? Who is this behaviour bad for? Is it something that's safe or not safe? Safe, even though it's disturbing to others, maybe it isn't. So, you know, something that you need to stop. You know, particularly if there is a lot of resistance, and we, you know, we talk about what is you know, fighting a battle that you may not win, which isn't, you know, which is more stressful to you and more stressful than it needs to be. Two more questions on symptoms, and then we'll move on to some other things. One is about appetite change, and particularly in this case in someone with a non-fluent variant PPA. And I suppose the first thing to say is that, as James very neatly showed in the first talk, these are all conditions part of the same group of illnesses, and so we do see the similar symptoms of behavioural variant FTD in the language forms as well. So people can get these other symptoms within the behavioural forms. I think that the concern was, despite having the change in appetite, they seem to have lost weight nonetheless. And I suppose that's something we see. James, something you see in your clinic?
Yeah, it's a really important thing. So losing too much weight is a real problem. It needs to be thought about. And unexplained weight loss is a real sort of medical concern and needs to be brought up with your specialist clinic. But what can sometimes happen is people gain a lot of weight in the year or two running up to the diagnosis, and then later lose the weight, that extra weight. And that I don't see as such a problem. So recovering your normal adult weight can be okay. But people sometimes lose the habits by which we eat, lose the ability to govern your own life and shopping and around the kitchen and making snacks. And so you may just be taking in less calories, less energy, and taste may also be changed. So there's all sorts of reasons why people may lose weight, but I would look to, you know, people getting enough food in. Has the quality of that food changed? Are they losing weight that they could afford to lose and perhaps put on just a year or two before the outset of the illness? But one thing I wouldn't do is to ignore it. It really does need a good explanation, and then make sure that someone's weight can be stabilised.
And I suppose the one thing to say is, it's only something we see commonly, is there's often a sense that they're eating more, but actually they're eating incredibly limited. The diet has become incredibly limited, and it's become sort of a limited group of often sweet things or specific foods, and actually there aren't other things going on. So there's a lot of whilst it feels like there's lots of sweet things going in, they're not eating other things because their diet has become so limited. So the actual overall intake is probably not as much, even though they're eating lots of sweet things.
And as a general, some of these illnesses, the brain illnesses, we think of as just being in the brain, but actually the whole body metabolism can be sped up. people can actually have a higher calorie demand, even though people may not be getting much exercise, they're not out walking, they're not going to work and back. Even if you think it's quite a passive lifestyle, actually the body needs more calories, and you've just got to keep up with that.
Okay, so one more question on symptoms, then we'll move on to talk about trials. This is a difficult question. So I think something we've had before, and I'll open this to everybody. My father is in denial about his condition, but it's clear that he has behavioural symptoms, and it's frustrating for his wife, and very difficult for her in particular to get help in for him, because he doesn't think there's a problem, and really difficult for her to solve things and get the relief in that she needs. So that's something I think is common. First thing to say is incredibly common in this condition, the denial of the disease and the lack of insight into the disease, and then that difficulty getting help in. So maybe Nikki, I'll start with you. It's a common thing that we get asked all the time.
Yeah, we do, and I think it was great with James's presentation earlier, talking about tolerance, understanding the diagnosis, understanding the lack of insight an awful lot, and you know, tolerating sort of what the little foibles would be of sort of someone's behaviour, basically. But I think when you're looking at, it is stressful for a carer, it is very stressful, and you know, carers do burn out very quickly, and you do need help. Trying to get him to understand he needs help when he doesn't think he needs help is not going to happen, but that carer needs help. So it's getting in the care and support for the carers. So it's taking that as that is not his problem, not at all. He's never going to accept that. And actually the problem is that you need that support as a carer. So it's carving out some time each day or several times a week, and actually having that time to recharge your batteries and finding the correct care that you need in the house, whether it might be with housework, might be with shopping, might be with cooking, it might be with an activity that you want to do together. But it's really having the emphasis on you yourself getting the care, and there's lots of agencies that can help with that.
And I think, Nikki, it's fair to, I'll pass it around in a second, but fair to say that your team would be happy to talk to people individually.
Absolutely,
about that.
Yeah.
So people can always follow up with you, Nikki.
Of course.
Yeah. But I think Nikki has sat in my clinic with me and been very helpful, and we've got through very, you know, suggestions like suggesting the person needs a personal assistant. Personal assistant is often much more accepted than a carer coming in. So there are definitely ways around that, and we've definitely thought of ways of getting that help in and getting the respite for the carer, which are helpful when people are in denial of the disease. I'm going to just go to Linda, whether you had that experience of James not really understanding what was happening. Linda, you're just on mute. You might have to unmute.
Sorry. No, he was always very aware until it advanced quite a lot. So I didn't really have that experience. But I would agree totally that it was me a lot of the time that actually needed the help, because it's exhausting, especially if you've got problems during the night and everything. So I would agree totally with that it is that sometimes most of the time it's the carers that need the help, actually. Yeah. And I understand why some carers unfortunately die before their loved ones, because burnout, as you said, it happens so quickly.
Great. I'm going to move on and talk, just because we still got lots of questions to get through, but I'm going to talk a little bit about trials. And Lucy, the first question is about where trials are going to be. Are they going to be just in the UK? There's a question about Ireland and other countries. So maybe just a sort of sense of where things are going to be.
Yeah, so I think the most of the trials will be worldwide. Definitely here in the UK will be based mainly in London, but I think, James, you might be taking on one. And I think there is a site in Dublin as well for one of the trials. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but we can definitely find that out and pass that information on if it's something that you're interested in. But again, across Europe, we've got many sites that are not only involved in GEMFI, but outside of that research group as well that are taking part, and we're always on the lookout for more sites that are seeing people with FTD that we can get involved as well. So hopefully it'll be a global trial.
And James, that's really helpful, Lucy. So I think people are always happy to ask us, and we definitely, even if there isn't a specific trial, sometimes for trials we can always fly people in, and we definitely have people from aboard in trials. James, that leads me on to some questions which I think nicely Lucy didn't talk about and you touched on, which is just trials for symptomatic therapies, and whether there are other things that can be helpful and things that you're looking at. You're on mute,
That's
James.
right. So I think a lot of the very exciting. Shouldn't be. Can people hear me now?
Yes, you can hear you. Just a slight delay.
Okay. Yes, I always think trials to try and slow or stop the illness need to go hand in hand with trials to treat people's symptoms. I think the first so-called disease-modifying drugs, these things designed to slow down and halt the illness, it's unlikely they'll be 100%. They're likely, if they work, to slow the illness down. What that paradoxically means is we have more people living with these challenging illnesses, so it's even more important that we think about the symptoms. And it just go hand in hand. I think it'd be wrong to just hold out hope for a magical cure in 10 or 20 years' time and not work on living here and now, making it an easier illness to live with. And in fact, these two things do come together. Sometimes some symptoms that put people at risk, well, if you treat them as a symptom, it will help the outlook as well. So we've been very interested in Cambridge in a number of trials, looking at ways to try and rebalance some of the brain chemicals that go awry. Often in FTDs and different FTDs, the brain runs low on particular chemicals that are needed for brain cells to talk together. People might know in Parkinson's disease, this drug called, say, a chemical called dopamine is very low, sort of in the media occasionally, and that's been being topped up by dopamine type drugs as the mainstay of treating Parkinson's for 50 years, since the late 60s. But it might be possible in FTD to take a similar approach to say, where people have a reduction in one of these particular brain chemicals, can we use well-known drugs to boost that back up to try and restore behavior? Some of you might have seen that already in practice. Some of the tablets that are known in the literature as antidepressant tablets can help improve some behaviors with nothing to do with depression at all, even in people with FTD who don't have depression, don't have any depressive symptoms, but the same type of drug can try and help with behavior. And I'm sure many people on the call will have come across things like the citalopram or sertraline or trazodone that are sometimes used for behavior in FTD, nothing to do with depression, even though they're known as antidepressants. It's just a kind of chemical rebalancing we're trying. That's one example, and there's the number of others that I think are ongoing, trying to help with symptoms. Behavioural treatments, behavioural interventions in a more formal way are also part of clinical trials. Are there things you can either teach the patient or train through the carer to do to make a difference to successful living with FTD? And we shouldn't forget that clinical trials also cover that type of behavioural and cognitive treatment. There are a lot of effort, and it still needs the evidence to know that they're effective. We wouldn't want to put a carer at extra burden of extra effort if it wasn't known to be an effective treatment. So yeah, symptoms I think is really important.
Great. I've got a couple of things, two sort of combined things, Lucy. One is, I think, just both around your talk, which is how do you know whether someone who is pre-symptomatic is imminently going to get symptoms? And maybe you could just touch on NFL for the Elector trial. And then the other is how we define mild symptoms for trials as well.
So it's a really good question and something that we've given a lot of thought and consideration to. So there's this thing called neurofilament light chain that we're able to measure in the body, and as this increases, we think that individuals are approaching the onset of symptoms in the next 5 years or so. So the higher this level is, the more likely you are to be closer to developing symptoms. And now in the Electra trial, they're hoping to use this measure to help them recruit those people who are very early in the disease into the trial, but based on this level. So they may not be showing any symptoms in their everyday life, but it may be that something's starting to change, and it might be an indicator that it's happening in the next few years or so. We don't know what that level is that they're using, their cutoff, so that will be kept blind from everybody, but we'll know if you're higher or lower than this cutoff level. So we won't be able to say for certain how close you are, but it would be that your risk is higher. And the second question was about assessing those mild symptoms. Most of the trials are using what's called the FTD-CDR, and this is basically a frontotemporal dementia staging instrument that we use in research, just to have a look at a broad range of symptoms that someone may experience. And there's 2 ways of scoring it. You can have like a sum of all the different scores, and it's more fine-grained to all these individual symptoms, or we can have a global score and a general look at how severe somebody might be, and you can score from 0 to 3 on this scale. And these early symptoms are looking around this 0 to 0.5 score, and most trials are looking at the 0.5 group at the moment. So these are really very mild symptoms that aren't very regular or frequent, but they do show up.
John, I wonder if I just mention it for a moment, just particularly if there are people who this, maybe in their family, they know there's a gene afoot, and if you do get these mild symptoms, it doesn't mean it's the dementia coming on. If one is feeling poor concentration, a bit stressed, a bit grumpy, difficult with colleagues, ordinary life has all these problems in as well. So do come forward to talk to your FTD clinic about it, but don't panic, because there may be other, what I might call innocent explanations, anxiety, mood, hormonal problems, anything, all sorts of those difficulties of everyday life that can cause similar symptoms. So there's no magic test, and there's certainly other things to think about. So.
I'm going to go 5 minutes over because I've got few more questions to go. If that's all right, Nikki, you can give me a nod if that's okay to go 5 minutes over. So Linda, one of the questions is from somebody. The question is the experience for your children with them being far away. This person has the experience that their mum was a widow and they live in another country, and they ended up having to place her in a care home because she wasn't safe, and obviously they feel very distraught about that and having to do it from afar. So do you have a sense from your experience of that?
Yeah, my son lives in Singapore, and but technology for us made all the difference. I mean, before 3 years, I managed to get him onto the plane to go out to Singapore and Thailand to meet our little granddaughter as well. It's really, really difficult for me, but it was certainly something worthwhile. I'm just so pleased I did it. But obviously, it is difficult when you've got people abroad. Very difficult. But what can you do, really? They feel helpless. But with technology, as I say, that helped to keep us in contact, and that was really important. And we didn't actually get to the stage where he needed a care home. COVID stopped that. So yeah, we escaped the final stages. I was struggling, but it is difficult when you've got people abroad. That's it, really.
Thank you so much, Linda. That's really helpful. Michael, I wanted to ask a question about lasting. We've got a couple of things, but one about lasting power of attorney. And I think there's some people get confused about initially registering the lasting power of attorney and then activating the power of attorney, and whether you need a capacity assessment for those things and which one you need. And I wonder whether you just do a little bit of clarification of some of that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that there are two types of lasting power of attorney. So the one that's for finance and property comes into effect as soon as it's registered. There's no capacity test. So the attorney can use that power, well, the person who's granted it, as soon as it's registered. With the health and welfare one, there does need to be confirmation that the person who's granted the power has lost capacity at that stage before it comes into effect, and obviously it needs to be registered as well with the Office of the Public Guardian.
And just obviously the question we're often asked in clinic is about the ability for that person. I think we're often asked in clinic whether the person has the capacity to be able to register it in the first place. And obviously you obviously need to, that person needs to be able to understand what it means to sign that power of attorney in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a section on the form where somebody, it can be someone who witnesses it, but somebody, either a professional or somebody who's known the donor for a long period of time, acknowledges that they have consent in order to grant the power of attorney.
I think this person is asking, I'm not quite sure whether it's around registration. It's about, they've said about obtaining it. Unfortunately, they've had an assessment of capacity cancelled twice due to the COVID pandemic. How do they deal with that? Does anyone have a solution to that? Yeah, Trish.
Yeah, there are problems with COVID interfering with face-to-face assessments, but there are capacity assessments being done virtually, just like other assessments have been done virtually, medical assessments and all sorts. In fact, Court of Protection's still working online. So you can push for it a little. And if you're struggling to find someone to do it, I'm not sure the GP will maybe be able to offer you time at this time because they're so busy with other things, because sometimes they can do an assessment if it's around medication and refusal of. But maybe the local authority would help you here. They might pass you on to somebody within an advocacy organisation that might help. But generally, if you were desperate and it was a very big decision and there was an immediate outcome, I think possibly a social worker would do it, and they could and will do it over the phone, often wanting to see you. So they might do it with a platform like this, or indeed, I've even known it to happen on a WhatsApp, face-to-face. People are really using technology any way they can in order to make room for these assessments.
Great, thanks, Trish. And again, I suppose if that person has specific questions, they have to contact the RDS team about things. The same with all of the questions. A couple of useful things people have asked about COVID vaccine and about the development and whether that genetic technology has been helpful. I suppose in a general sense, you know, the drugs that Lucy was talking about, the ASOs and the AAVs, they're amazing technology, and they've really developed a bit like, you know, the way that the mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, has been developed. This is, you know, new genetic technology over the years. I mean, the speed of the COVID vaccine has been an amazing piece of science, but actually when we think about the fact that we're now at a stage of being able to give an artificial gene into somebody by an inactivated virus, and that trial is starting to happen in progranulin related FTD, that's also an amazing piece of science. And I think, you know, this, if we think back to how quickly things have moved over 10 years, you know, the COVID is just perhaps an accelerated version, but I mean, I think that is amazing, amazing science. So I think that's we've got through, as always, I flick up and down through questions. I think we've got through most of those things, and I think we probably don't have time to cover other things because, as usual, I have to remember that we have a video before we go. So I'm going to say, if you have other questions and specific things, very happy to answer them. I can see there are some things in the chat which we didn't get round to, but very happy, and the whole panel, I think, very happy to answer those questions. Any questions about specific things, please email Nikki and her RDS team. They're amazing and they're there to help you. I really would like to thank everybody again. So James, very kind of you to come and talk about things. Lucy, who I know is coming and attending on her week off. Linda, really kind of you to give us your experience, and really such a powerful story. Thank you very much. Trish and Michael, thank you for your help on an ongoing basis and being part of the team, and I'm sure there'll be people contacting you after today. The last thing to say is thank you to all for attending. We do hope at some point we'll all be back in person and can meet back again, but in the meantime we'll be running virtual meetings. Please do come and attend. Please do be part of the RDS. The RDS is hoping to have a more physical space in the future, and that will be helped through the National Brain Appeal, which is the charity at UCL and UCLH. And what you're going to hear next is a little bit from the MBA and about the kind of support that they provide for us. So thank you all for attending. Please do listen to the video from the National Brain Appeal.
Hello, my name is Eva Tate and I'm the Major Appeals Manager and Manager of the Rare Dementia Support Fund held by the charity the National Brain Appeal. The National Brain Appeal raises money as the dedicated charity for the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and UCL Queen's Square Institute of Neurology. The National Brain Appeal raises funds for Rare Dementia supports 2,000 members to help individuals living with rare and early onset forms of dementia, their families, friends and healthcare professionals. And we also hold several other funds for FTD and dementia research. The funding helps not only the support group meetings in London, but also the regional support groups, admin and support staff and all other associated expenses, including the new online support groups. When things return to normal, there are travel and accommodation bursaries available to help members attend the meetings. This year, we've raised our fundraising target to 300,000, and this will rise further to 350,000 by 2022 to develop and extend the service in the areas of education, support and research, with the ultimate aim that everyone affected by a form of rare dementia will have access to specialist information and support, as well as contact with other people with a similar condition. We apply for grants from grant-making trusts, foundations and livery companies and have a wonderful group of supporters, some of whom are here today, who fundraise for us in an amazing variety of ways. We would love it if you would like to sign up to our RDS fundraising newsletter to hear more of these stories and receive news of how we can support this community. We have had people do head shaves for us. We have had a gentleman drive across the Mongolian steppe in a VW Polo, and we have lots of people who take part in runs and virtual runs as well. At the end of February, we held a gala dinner called Mission Possible, where we raised 110,000 for the expansion of rare dementia support. And we are delighted to announce that in line with this expansion, the charity is committed to raise up to 7 million to create the world's first centre of excellence for rare dementias. If anyone would like to discuss any fundraising ideas or the new capital appeal, please do feel free to email me or my colleague Alexis, our Senior Fundraising Manager, who will speak about the innovative new ways you can be involved in fundraising for RDS, even during this challenging time. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Alexis Gebby and I'm the Senior Fundraising Officer at the National Brain Appeal. I just want to start off by saying a huge thank you to all of you who already fundraise for RDS. We really appreciate all of your incredible efforts, especially at this difficult time. My role at the National Brain Appeal is to look after all the amazing people taking on various fundraising activities for us. We have had people challenging themselves to run marathons, cycle long distances, climb mountains, and even take on skydives, all whilst raising money for RDS. We also have wonderful fundraisers out in the community who organise golf days, hold coffee mornings, host choir and carol concerts, and even shave their heads. These people ensure that more people like you can be supported through rare dementia support. If you're interested in becoming one of our fundraising heroes, then please do contact me. I am here to support you with your fundraising, and I'm more than happy to chat about any ideas that you may have. While at the moment it isn't possible to take part in a sporting challenge or hold a big fundraising gathering in your local community, we do have some fundraising ideas, such as taking on a solo virtual run or walk, hosting a quiz for your friends or family online, asking for birthday donations in lieu of going out, or even donating money that you may be saving by not travelling to work or buying your daily coffee. Do get in touch with me if you would like to get involved. In the meantime, take care and we hope to see you soon.